Hello, everybody, and welcome again to The Sacred Life. I am your host, David Baylor. Glad that you could all join us again, or join me again here this evening. Tonight, as the thumbnail and as the title of this video suggests, we're going to be talking again about church history. Only this time, we're going to be looking at some aspects of the Reformation. Like a lot of, I don't know, especially people we see online talking about orthodoxy, it seems a lot of us are converts. Actually, a pretty significant portion of Orthodox Christians in the United States are actually converts at this point. And so this question is one that I think a lot of us have grappled with. And it's one I think a lot of people in the church and in Protestant traditions really don't quite know what to do or what to think about this. We kind of tend to have this view of the Reformation, if we're coming from a Protestant perspective, that we think this is this great moment in history, this triumph of truth and reason over the dead traditions of the Catholic Church, and things like that. When really, if we look at the history and we look at the fruits of the Reformation, we really see something quite different. Before I get really into the main part of the conversation here, once again, I do want to mention there's a number of ways you can support me and those of us here at the Sacred Life. What we do, there's not only me at the Sacred Life, there's also my brother John, our friend Aaron Beachy. We often have conversations. We'll be recording more of those in the future. In addition to that, I'm doing these live streams now, and me and John are both producing some solo content as well. And ways that you can help produce us or help support us so we can produce more content, better content, so I can spend more time on research of topics like this. If you think this is valuable, check out the links in the description below. I am an iconographer. You can check out the links to my website. That is probably the best way to support us. Purchase icons off the website. I have some examples just so you can see them. Here's one I did recently of St. George and the Dragon. So you can see that. And I have another one here of St. Nicholas. There you can kind of see the gold shining in the light. So that's a good way to support us. There's also links to our Patreons. And I have actually enabled super chats now on these live streams. So if you want to contribute just a little bit, one-time thing, that's a way you can do it too. No obligation or anything, definitely. But then we're also working on introducing channel memberships, and in the future, doing some members-only content, that kind of thing. That's something that we'll really start doing in earnest once we get a bigger following and once we think we can really start doing members-only content. But, first I have to earn your respect, I guess you could say, give you a reason to do that. So that's what you can do to support us. I know that's enough for that for now. Let's get into the topic of tonight's stream, where again, we're looking at the Reformation and why I don't think, as an Orthodox Christian, that the Reformation was really a great thing. And even before I was Orthodox, I kind of had that opinion. So let's look at my ideas here a little bit, and then I'd like to hear what you have to say. Leave your comments in the chat. I will try to get to them at the end of my talk here. Have a little bit of a Q&A session, and definitely appreciate your input, your participation. Feel free to ask whatever you want, even if it's not necessarily related to the video. So first of all, it's important to point out the Reformation was a response to legitimate problems that existed in the medieval Roman Catholic Church and medieval Roman Catholicism, I should say. And now, as an Orthodox Christian, I do believe that these problems really are these problems in the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, are the direct fruit of the schism of Rome being cut off from communion with the church, which I believe is the Orthodox Church, and falling into heresy because of their rebellion, because of the, I don't know, the pride, I guess you might say, of the See of Rome. And also, I do, in a lot of ways, see the Reformation as kind of like reaping the fruits that were sown and that were planted by Rome's rebellion, Rome's pride. So it's kind of like a furthering and a deepening of the schism, and also the fruit and the result of schism. So what the Reformation did, while it was a response to legitimate errors, it really only compounded those errors in the end. It wasn't really a movement in the right direction. It was just a movement further into schism, further into error. I also pretty firmly believe, and if you saw my Friday stream, a lot of you have watched that stream, and thanks for tuning in. And if you haven't, I do recommend you go watch that so you can see this idea kind of expressed a little more thoroughly in how I view it, but I'll just kind of skim over it now. That schism and division is not a viable option in Christianity. It is a grave sin. It's not the way that we should ever deal with falsehood, with false teaching, things like that. And if we're in a situation where we find that that's the only answer, then it's a pretty good indication that what we're in is not the church, and we ought to go searching for Christ's actual church, because it does exist. Somebody can't just simply set up their own rival altar or their own rival communion or something like that. But the matter, like trying to have some understanding for the people of the era, the matter wasn't so simple. But the only true solution would have been to seek unity with Christ's church, with the Orthodox Church, because you can't, there's no such thing as reformation of Christ's church. I believe that's thoroughly unbiblical, thoroughly unscriptural. Maybe someday I'll do a follow-up stream where I get more into the theological aspects of my argument there. And again, like I said, it's essentially answering one evil with another, and a movement distinctly in the wrong direction. So what happened as a result of the Reformation was not a return to Christian orthodoxy, but rather it was kind of an eruption into this chaos. The Reformation pretty quickly collapses into disarray, only finding some semblance of unity within certain territories, and that's only imposed by military force through the process of a lot of violence and bloodshed. And this, again, only once the Protestant movements were pretty thoroughly hijacked by political interests, who saw it as an opportunity to elevate their own position, maybe within the Holy Roman Empire, for example, or maybe contra the Holy Roman Empire, and consolidate their power. The Reformation was never united to begin with. For example, there's a sharp division immediately between Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli. I mean, those divisions only grew deeper over time, and at times pretty violent. We have rival confessions appearing on the scene immediately, people mutually excommunicating each other, and ultimately even killing each other because of their different interpretations of the scripture, you might say. The only thing that really unites Protestants pretty much into the modern era is their mutual hatred of the papists, of the Roman Catholics, which pretty quickly, quickly again leads to open religious warfare. I mentioned a few examples of the rival confessions. We have obviously the Lutherans, the Reformed traditions. There's even several different formed traditions that aren't really in union with each other, even though they follow more or less the same doctrines, or did originally. And of course, you also have people like the Anabaptists, and you have to remember the Anglicans in there as well, although their relationship to the Reformation is, shall we say, a bit more complicated. The divisions are pretty sharp. So we have things like the Marburg Colloquy in 1529, where Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli met. They failed to come into any agreement on the Eucharist. So there could be no unification between them. It ends with them mutually excommunicating and condemning each other. So from the beginning, the Swiss Reformed and the German Lutheran traditions are against each other. They see each other as heretics. They condemn each other as heretical movements. Luther calls the Zwinglians fanatics, and John Calvin's Geneva excommunicates anybody, any dissent. Anabaptists are persecuted by everybody, by the Lutherans, by the Reformed, by the Catholics. There's over 2,000 executed in the 1520s to 1530s. A lot of additional persecution that will continue for centuries, and especially in Protestant countries. They would actually generally find more acceptance in Catholic territories or Orthodox territories, with a lot of the Dutch Mennonites finding refuge in the Russian Empire, for example. So we have things like the Schmalkaldic War in 1546 to 1547, somewhere from 10,000 to 15,000 casualties as a result of this religious war. We have the Peasants' Wars in 1524 and 1525 that are at least in part fueled by fanatical Lutheran ideas, but at the same time also suppressed with Luther's approval. And this kills somewhere from 100,000 to 130,000 peasants. So we see right away what's happening in the era of the Reformation is very, very violent, very divisive. And these are sowing the roots of division that persist until today. We sometimes like to point to extreme fringe groups like the Munsterites or other radical Anabaptist groups, and those, especially those associated, again, like the Munsterites, with the Peasants' Wars, the Peasants' Rebellions, where you get a lot of religious ideology mixing with political and economic unrest, and it creates these very dangerous situations. Again, that's what's going on in the Peasants' Wars kind of in general. So there's a lot of mixture between there and this, religious ideologies adding to this very tense, like already very tense situation, causes it to just explode into violence. There were campaigns of violence fought all across Europe in order to enforce the Reformation on populations that often didn't want it. Like I know this a lot from studying Swiss history, studying my own history as a Swiss, coming from the background as a Swiss Anabaptist, how for the most part the Reformation in Switzerland has to be enforced on rural populations that don't want it. Catholic clergy have to be forcibly expelled, and soldiers stationed in villages in order to prevent the people from throwing out the Protestant ministers. And at times even like open revolt against the state in order to resist the Reformation. This is something that happens in Switzerland and Germany and other places. Obviously, France, we'll talk about France later. It's very extreme in France. And, everything that happens throughout the history of England. Protestant confessions and rites were imposed on entire communities with the sword, and extreme measures were taken to put down any resistance, but they were not content simply to mandate what was taught and practiced in their own territories. So the magisterial reformers would even go to the extent of marching to war on their neighbors in their misguided efforts to liberate them from Rome and bring them the true gospel. Or where they didn't have the power to do so, Protestant groups would resort to actions of extreme terror and violence. Again, some examples here of what I'm talking about. I already mentioned the Munster Rebellion, but just a little bit more detail on that this group of radicals established a theocracy where they kind of ruled this city, the city of Munster in Germany, with these extreme religious ideologies, especially thinking that it's like the apocalypse, basically, and that they're establishing the New Jerusalem. This ultimately leads to them coming under siege, and during the siege, there's something like 600 executions. Already mentioned the Peasants' Wars. In Geneva, I mentioned a little bit about that already. How Calvin's consistory would enforce doctrine by excommunication and execution. Up to and including burning people for heresy. So, people often like to pin that on Catholics and like, oh, the Catholics were burning the heretics. Well, so were the Protestants. In fact, I think if you dig into the numbers, you're going to find the Protestants actually killed far, far more people for heresy than the Catholics ever did. You have the violent dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s in England. You do have that in Switzerland as well. I don't know. I didn't look up the hard numbers for either of those. There's Protestant mobs in the Netherlands, destroying churches and religious art in over 400 churches, which ultimately leads to a revolution with over 100,000 deaths. And then the wars in France fought to liberate. In many ways, it's really the first French Revolution. That is the Huguenots, who were Calvinists fighting against the Catholic, that results in about 2 to 4 million deaths, including the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. In this one, the Protestants are the ones being massacred. But, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is not necessarily that the Protestants themselves are the ones doing all the violence, but that the Protestant Revolution, I'll just call it that, results in a lot of violence and a lot of division, and ushers in a very terrible age in European history, in Western history. I'm just looking through all the data and information I have here. It's like, well, I could go after point after point after point demonstrating this same pattern, especially when it comes to France. The situation in France, as I pointed out, was just tragic. Like, it was the first. I think it is accurate to think of it in a lot of ways as the first French Revolution, but this one ultimately was suppressed. But perhaps the most damning thing from an Orthodox perspective that happened during the French Huguenot Wars was in 1562, when the Huguenots took over the city of Lyon, and caused extreme damage to the Church of Saint Irenaeus, up to and including the destruction of the saint's tombs and relics, and even reportedly using his skull as a soccer ball in a desecratory game. Saint Irenaeus is one of our most beloved saints. He died in 202 AD. Is one of our most important witnesses of early Christianity, and he was, he's, like I said, a beloved church father. He was the Bishop of Lyon, and his relics they're gone today because the Calvinists destroyed. In their iconoclastic rampage, they just utterly destroyed his relics because they were idols and needed to be destroyed. There's more and more I could go on with this, because the violence spreads out, into Hungary, into Poland, into Sweden, Lithuania. Violence extends into Eastern Europe, even with like Calvinist terrorist activities, even in Orthodox countries. And a lot of this is because, like, Calvinism develops this emphasis on purification that leads to, like, a very extreme form of iconoclasm and violent means to enforce that. And like you see that continuing in Calvinist traditions into the 19th and 20th centuries. So, like, very often the Reformation in some of these countries was enforced by violent mobs or brought about by violent riots, a lot of destruction and a lot of death. And they create this religious landscape in which they're like radically trying to enforce the truth and pure religion, but it just creates this extremely divided religion that, it sows the fruit of our modern religious landscape where there's no real unity. um And once you have developed these like extreme puritanical ideas, like you're gonna find yourself in a situation where it's hard to disagree, or it's hard to find yourself agreeing with anybody about anything. And you can justify in your mind any disagreement and any kind of division over that disagreement, and ultimately even extremely violent and destructive ways of enforcing uh, your ways of doing things. I kind of, as a slip of the tongue, referred to the Protestant Reformation as the Protestant Revolution, and that's because kind of what I'm trying to present here is that the Protestant Reformation is actually the first act of this ongoing revolution that we've seen sweep across the world since then. Some people like to point to the French Revolution as like the opening act of the revolution, but really I think it's the Reformation. I think the Reformation is what destroys the Christian world and ushers in the modern world. It would just take it would take quite a while for us to completely dismantle the world that we had built, the institutions that we had, and completely usher in this modern project. But I do think the Protestant Reformation is the first act of that. Um, I think what the Protestants ushered in would ultimately leave them behind, but that's kind of what the Reformation or what the Revolution always does. Is the original heroes of the Revolution always turns on them, and yeah, the Protestant Christianity is like, yeah, it's the first act of that. It's the first place where we see that pattern starting to take place at least in the modern world. So yeah, it was the death of the world of the Christian world and the birth of the modern world. And I think the reformers sincerely thought they were going to cast out the errors of Rome and usher in like this golden age of Christianity and create this beautiful Christian world. But instead, what they created was basically hell on earth. And that might seem a pretty radical statement for us, like for me sitting here today saying, no, Protestantism created hell. But again, once we actually dive into the history of the Reformation, and especially like the 2 centuries following the Reformation, because that's really how long it takes for the Reformation to be worked out in Western Europe. Um, I mean, in some cases, even longer than that. But during that period, just what we see is violence and destruction. And I mean, just to be frank, evil unleashed on a scale that we had not seen before then. Um, I think, my experience with this growing up is that this period in history is kind of glossed over in a lot of ways as a footnote, and that what happened during this age is kind of not really acknowledged by a lot of us in the modern world. But what happened during this period is why Europe and the West in general, in the centuries that followed, with the ushering in of the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, and all of this, would abandon Christianity entirely and usher in this religion of secularism. Where we have to completely remove Christianity from any position of influence. I'm not going to say it's correct, because I do believe that the world should be Christian, and that the leaders of this world should be in submission to the church and to God and to Christ as their king. serving and working in the name of God. But what we see happening in history during this time is so totally the opposite of that. And when you get these really theocratic states in a lot of cases in early modern Europe, which just try to impose their religious dogma in very extreme ways, both on their people and upon their neighbors, you can understand why the Western project, why the project of modernism turned the way that it did. And then I would say modernism really is the fruit of the Reformation. Just checking on how much time I've been going here. I have some hard numbers here. I don't know. I don't know how far I want to go into that. I think where I'll go for now is just to move to the period starting about 100 years after the Reformation, where this extreme division and instability that's ushered in by the Reformation ultimately leads to the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War, it's a bit simplistic to call it a religious war. It starts out, I think it's accurate to say it starts out as a religious war, and quickly, I don't know, I think the best way to describe it is that it pretty quickly devolves into chaos. I mean, it's called the 30 Years' War because it lasts for 30 years from 1618 to 1648. And it's mostly an internal conflict in the Holy Roman Empire, although some other powers become involved in a bit usually indirect ways. But there is intense fighting, for example, along the border of Germany and France. There's just absolute destruction. I think it's one of the first wars in which artillery plays a major role. And what you see as a result of that is just like the countryside, like the entire countryside and entire cities and villages and towns in the front lines of the war just being completely laid to waste. And so the battle casualties during the 30 years of war amount to around 450,000, but the scale of the fighting, the area over which it was fought, like the sheer size of the area over which it was fought, and just the absolute level of destruction that was wrought on the countryside results in extreme levels of disease and famine, to where in some areas you see losses comparable to what you saw maybe 300 years earlier, not quite 300 years earlier in the Black Death, where there's 50 to 60% of the population of, even major cities, some even more than that. So like the city of Wurtemberg declines from 450,000 people to 97,000 people. Maybe 20 to 30% of the population of, well, it's difficult to call it Germany, but the German Empire, I guess, is killed. 4.5 to 8 million deaths, both as a result of, like, direct result of battle, but most of those because of the famine and disease brought on by this war. So it really is this apocalyptic event in a lot of ways, and just extreme devastation. I have this figure here, for whatever it's worth, that there's around 2,000 castles just completely destroyed in Germany. Again, like I mentioned, miles and miles and miles of farmland just laid waste. These ancient towns and villages in the area of the conflict abandoned. Yeah, I don't need to. I guess I don't need to press that too far. You kind of get the picture that I'm painting here. And so what I'm trying to lay out in this stream is just this concept that the Reformation really was a failure. It failed to accomplish everything that it set out to accomplish, and what it did accomplish was just terrible. The fruits of the Reformation were awful, and we're still today, in a lot of ways, trying to recover from that. I think if you kind of wrap your mind around what actually happened in the 200 years following the Reformation, the religious wars didn't end with the 30 Years' War. Like in Switzerland, for example, they continue into the 19th century. And really the only thing ultimately that ends the religious wars in Europe is the adoption of secularism. And so on the one hand, you can kind of understand the argument of the secularist, but I think the truth of the matter is you have to step back and say, like, wait a minute, actually, Christianity is not to blame for this, because what was being fought over here was not Christianity. What was being fought over was these pseudo-Christianities that had been hijacked for political reasons and then forced on the population. And then people becoming caught up and becoming basically slaves to these doctrines in this very idolatrous way. And it's just like, it's something that really, really disturbed me before I converted to Orthodoxy. I would have never considered myself a Protestant. I was an Anabaptist. And as Anabaptists, we always had the view of ourselves that we were really the victims of the Reformation, that we were the people that everybody's anger and frustration was taken out on. We were the people that they killed. But the Reformation, the fruits of it were just terrible. And again, like I'm saying, like looking at this from my perspective before I was Orthodox, encountering the sort of thing that I was talking about on the Friday stream, encountering these ideas like, well, the church is going off in this crazy direction. Maybe you're a Protestant saying this, we're seeing things like women being installed, or the embracing of homosexuality, or whatever it might be. And so, it's time for a new Reformation, or we need to continue the project of the Reformation. And I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean it's time for more religious violence? Do you mean it's time for more division and hatred? Like, you got yourselves pushed into this situation where you have no real power or influence over the culture because of what you did when you had that power and influence. And you're left trying to pick up the pieces, but it's like you're not willing to look back on your own history honestly, assess the situation, and admit, okay, maybe we made a mistake here. And that's what I did personally. It was actually kind of putting together a presentation kind of like this for my own church, where I was asked to do some presentation on church history, where I really had to grapple with these facts that I've presented here, and more, going into even more detail than what I went to here, where I'm just so struck by what actually happened and how terrible it was. And then looking at the situation we find ourselves in today and saying, like, well, this all makes sense. This is just the same thing. The only reason Protestants aren't openly killing each other is because that power has been taken away from them in a lot of ways. Like, I think when you get down to it, if you look in the 16th and 17th centuries, what Calvinists were up to in parts of Europe are really comparable in a lot of ways to really Islamic extremist terrorist violence. So it really is an ideology that from its inception, like, I can't possibly believe that this ideology is the gospel, that it's Christianity, because of what its fruits have been. And again, I think the only reason we're not seeing those fruits today is just because its power has been taken away. You know, like I have to think of Daniel's prophecy, where you have been weighed in the balance and been found wanting, and so now your kingdom will be taken away from you. And that's really what's happened with Protestantism. I think that's the best assessment for what's happened in the modern world. Is the Protestant project was a dismal and absolute failure of an unimaginable degree, with consequences that were extremely severe. We're talking about maybe 20 million or more people killed as a direct or indirect result of the religious wars that swept across Europe in the following centuries. Um, and so my challenge, again, with this video is just to look at the history, try to look at it honestly and ask yourself, what do I do with this? And I'm suggesting to you the answer that I came to is, well, what you do with this is first admit this was wrong. But then you step back and you find yourself in the situation that led up to the Reformation. You're like, well, that was wrong too. And so what do you do? And I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing such growth in orthodoxy, is because, I mean, I don't think a lot of these people are necessarily aware of the history that I'm talking about, the history of Protestantism, the history of Western Christianity in the modern era. Because again, like I said earlier in the stream, that's something I think for the most part has been kind of pushed out of our consciousness. It's like we try to pretend that didn't really happen, or not really acknowledge it, but it did happen. And I guess where I'm going at with that is I think people in the West are starting to realize that the options that we have in the West, none of them are really the truth. This is one of the reasons, I'm doing this series on church history, and this episode in particular, where I'm focusing on the Reformation and its immediate fallouts. And that's just a big part of the reason why I personally became Orthodox. I think on the next stream that I do, where I'm discussing church history, we're going to look more particularly at secularism and modernism. Kind of a continuation of this video, how those are really the conclusion of the Reformation, and especially of the Reformed tradition and the Calvinist tradition. That this is what it kind of logically leads to. And I'll throw in a little bit of St. Gregory Palamas with that. So that's kind of a teaser for next time. I think I'm continuing to kind of develop my live stream schedule. So I've kind of changed it, or at least I think I have. Maybe by the time I get to Friday, it will change again. But for now, what I'm thinking is Monday streams are going to look at history. Tuesday streams are going to be kind of a more casual conversation, or kind of off the top of my head. Maybe something a little more topical for what's going on. And Friday streams will probably be focusing more on theology and philosophy. And part of the reason why I've decided to do that is because as I dive into the history-related topic, I realize it's actually, in a lot of cases, pretty difficult to divorce theology and philosophy from history. So I think I kind of have to deal with both of those at once. Okay, I'm going to start addressing some questions. If you have any questions that you'd like to leave in the chat, go ahead and do so. We'll spend a little bit of time here for Q&A if anybody's interested. And again, it doesn't have to be about the subject of this video either. If it's another video of ours, whether it's one of my live streams, an interview that I've done, whether it's one of the conversations with the three of us, whether it's something about my own experience, my own journey into Orthodoxy, my Mennonite background, any of those things. Well, first of all, I would say that's probably going to be what I'm going to talk about tomorrow in my Tuesday stream, is a little bit of that more Mennonite side of things, and especially aimed at people who are Mennonites or were Mennonites, and why I think all Mennonites need to become Orthodox. So maybe if you have some questions about that, I'll answer tomorrow, or maybe if you have some good questions tonight, that'll help me think of some things tomorrow too. So yeah, if you've got some questions, go ahead and leave them in the chat, and I'll start getting to them here. Joshua Donahue here has been asking this question. He asked in our three-way Thursday night stream that I did with a couple of friends. We're going to try to do most Thursdays anyway. I don't know that we're going to do it every Thursday, but he asked us what we think of Taylor's new album, and he commented on the stream tonight and said, "I will get your thoughts on the album this time." And I guess my thoughts, Joshua, is that I don't have any thoughts, because I have never intentionally listened to a Taylor Swift song in my life. I'm sorry if that disappoints you. I'm sorry if the Swifties in the chat are maybe going to start. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe I got myself into some trouble. But I hope that's not a disappointment to you. No, that was just a fun question. But I'm not seeing any other questions coming in tonight. I don't know if you say your name Agnello or Agnello. Not sure how to pronounce that. You left a few comments here, kind of relating to the video, and I guess I would wonder if you are kind of alluding to the Protestant Reformation as the beast, or the woman riding the beast, I should say, or as the whore of Babylon. At least to me, that's what your comments here are kind of suggesting. If you have something to weigh in on there, I'll give you a little bit of chance. I'll kind of stall for time a little bit more in case anybody else has any questions. I'm a little bit surprised. We've got a decent amount of live viewers, but you all are just not very talkative tonight for whatever reason, which is fine, I guess. Maybe I'm doing such a good job of explaining everything that I have to say that I just don't leave any questions left to be asked. No, that's probably not true. It's just, if you're not watching this live, leave your questions in the comments. If I don't answer the comments, I probably will still consider them and maybe address them in a future video or in a short or something like that. So yeah, don't feel like you're not able to ask your questions. If you'd like to be involved live on your question, I guess just wait for the next stream. Make sure to tune in. Mondays, Tuesdays, and Fridays, I'm always here at 7 o'clock. Try to do my talk for half an hour, 45 to 45 minutes maximum, and then spend a little bit of time after that in live Q&A. With whatever you all have to ask, want to talk about. Do check out our other videos. If you're not subscribed already, I would appreciate it if you would drop a subscription. And again, check out the links in the comment if you'd like to support what we're doing here. We're really trying to start putting a lot of work into the channel here to grow it. We do have a lot of projects that we're working on. Most of all, the animation project. You've probably heard us mention that several times by now, and I'll keep mentioning that. We're kind of still working on putting our team together and figuring out kind of the logistical side of things. But we're excited about that. We think that's something that's going to be a lot of benefit for a lot of people, not only Orthodox Christians, but we hope everybody. And I kind of hope it's something that will help lead a lot of people to the church. So if you'd like a way to support that, I mean, all the ways that support the channel now also support that project. Olaf mentions here he's got a print of an icon that I did of St. Paisios. And fortunately, that icon, I no longer have it for sale because somebody bought it. But you can check out my website. That was actually one of my favorite icons that I've made so far. I'm probably going to make another one. Or you can check out my website if you'd like to buy prints of it. Or I do custom commissions as well, custom work. Joshua promises, well, he doesn't promises. He says I might have a question next time. So that'd be nice. Yeah, it looks like there's not any more questions coming in. I'll leave just a little bit more time here. I guess just reminding everybody again, these some examples of my work that I do. Oops. Just so you can kind of see the style. It's more of a medieval style of iconography rather than the modern style that most modern iconographers are doing. So it'd be a little bit of a unique kind of icon. I think I mentioned this earlier. Maybe I didn't. Maybe I forgot. I am running a really big sale on my website right now on all of my original hand-painted icons or on icon commissions. If you purchase those through my website, it's actually 40% off right now. So this is a great time to buy some icons. If you want to have some quality hand-painted icons, I definitely recommend hand-painted icons over prints if you can get them. But I understand not everybody can afford that. But right now is a great opportunity because they're 40% off. I think it's a pretty good deal. Yeah, I'm not seeing any more comments coming in, any more questions coming in, I should say. So I think that's it for now. I hope you all enjoyed the stream tonight. If you like content like this, let me know. I'll I want to make content that you, my audience, enjoys. If you didn't like it, let me know. If you thought this was a bunch of crap, tell me that too. That helps me know what works, what doesn't. Again, I appreciate you tuning in, and I would like to wish you all peace in Christ.